Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are sitting down once again with our friend Duncan Pile. Duncan was on the podcast last year with, I think, 5 guests talking to us about a book he contributed to. He had a lot of interesting things to share, and we brainstormed a bunch of different topics to bounce around on the show. So he was here last week to talk to us about his deconstruction journey. Today he's going to talk to us about a place where deconstruction has led him to. And so, Duncan, welcome back to the show. You are officially a regular now with your 3rd visit.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be back.
Definitely. So last week you took us down the rabbit hole of your deconstruction journey. We heard about your faith, how you grew up, kind of where you are now, what brought you from there to here. But one of the places that deconstruction has led you to is this place called mysticism, which is our
Yeah.
topic for today. So I was wondering, maybe stemming off of your story from last week, can you tell us like a little bit about how you discovered mysticism, what that word and all that it entails has meant for you in your journey? Because I feel like mysticism, it's kind of like a buzzword these days, and I feel like everybody kind of defines it a little bit differently. And we've had a few different guests actually on the show talking about it, and everybody seems to come at it from like a different angle. So maybe take us into it, your perspective, your story, and I'll follow your lead.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, so mysticism isn't a word I grew up with.
Mhm.
It's not a word I sort of deliberately cottoned onto, really. It's just sort of found its way into my vocabulary because from what I understand of it, it describes my experience. And I think that is the core of mysticism, is the experience of the divine.
Mm.
So the emphasis of my faith has always been the relationship with God. But I like the term the divine. I mean, God, it's a bit clumsy, isn't it? It's a rubbish word. It's dog backwards,
Yeah, right.
So I like to sort of see it in gentler and broader terms.
Hmm.
But my experience of God began within the evangelical framework. So my conversion experience, which we discussed last time, was simply me becoming aware of the presence of God, as people may refer to it,
Hmm.
although that implies there's an absence at other times, which I don't believe. But still, there was this awareness which occurred, and being conscious of this being all around me, within me, this being of power and love, came out of nowhere. And I just said, I'm yours.
Mm.
And that was my sort of conversion, as my church would call it.
Hmm.
And I pursued that journey. I began to go in earnest when I was about 19. And please excuse me if there's a sweat trickling down my forehead. It's exceedingly hot in here.
With no air conditioning, mind you,
Yeah,
listeners.
no air conditioning at all, and a very hot week in the summer after many cold weeks. Anyway, so as an evangelical, from a sort of conservative background, after my initial experience of the divine, I was just sort of sucked into church routines and all the rest of it, and it was dry and it was boring.
Mm.
But I was sort of devoted. I was brought up to be that way. All my brothers were Christians or something like that. So I tried really hard to make it work. When I left home, went to university, things got just really tough. Like it wasn't working for me anymore. And I was drying up, and again, that's language from that group.
Mm.
I just felt like I was losing my faith.
Mm.
Any sense of the awareness of God or closeness to God was just falling away. And so I got really serious about it. I said, right, I'm going to pray every day, and I'm going to read my Bible. And I dedicated 2 hours a day to dry and dull and spiritless religious experience. It was awful. It was dreadful. I
Yeah.
hated it. And after 6 months of doing that, I had reached a place of utter desperation. And the big turning point for me is I was doing some gardening as a summer job. I was back at home. And I was trying to pray. I had these Bible verses written on little cards, as again, my tradition would encourage. And I was looking at
Me
these
too.
verses, I was reading them, and they meant nothing to me. They were just dead words. And I got to the point, partly because of the exercise, it was a hot day, much like today. I was frustrated, I was depressed, and these cards meant nothing to me. And I'd been struggling for months. And in the end, I threw my spade on the ground. And in a fit of pique, I said, God, knowing you should be the most extraordinary experience. It should be the best thing in life. And I am depressed. I am bored. And I said, as far as I'm concerned, it's my job to seek you and yours to bless me. And I waited there sort of for the lightning strike. Actually, it was a major turning point. I think God, the divine, however we refer to him or her, likes that kind of bravery, that kind of integrity and seriousness. And I always encourage people to talk to God honestly. And actually, it was a major turning point for me. And after that, I started to have sort of a bit of guidance, which again, I never received back in those days, to go and speak to Christians who seemed like they enjoyed their faith. If I wanted to enjoy mine, I should speak to who it seemed to make happy. So that meant going away from all the really serious dour reformed individuals, I mean, God bless them, and seeking out some other folk. And they were the charismatics and the Pentecostals. And again, I'm not going to be preaching that that's the way either. But they were happier, much happier in their experience. And so I had this sort of contrast of this spiritless Christianity and then this kind of much fuller, warmer Christianity in which God would interact with us and touch us, speak to us. And I began to experience that, and it completely transformed my life. And to be honest, I live in that today. I mean, although I'm no longer a charismatic or a Pentecostal or any denomination really, I have kept what I got there and deepened it and grown with it. But, and I'm sorry this story's a bit long, but there is a point to it.
Yeah.
I still wasn't satisfied. I'd started to use the sort of spiritual gifts of Corinthians and all that sort of thing. I wasn't really interested in just praying for other people, because those gifts are for service. They're not for yourself, really. I wanted to feel God's presence, be aware of God's closeness, which is more than closeness in the end, much greater than closeness. But I wanted to feel that for me and to hear or feel him communicate with me. So I just kept asking and asking and asking. I would not stop. And there are verses in the Bible that say things like, he's able to do more than we can ask or imagine. I'm like, come on then. Like I was always in God's space.
Right. Need more.
But where is this thing? And it all came to a head one day when I was praying. I was a missionary and I was living on a ship on the far side of the world. And I was praying in the dirty old engine hold at the bottom of the ship for hours.
You're like Paul.
I'm not. And I remember thinking, there's something missing, there's something wrong, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And then it just came out of me like a trumpet blast, and I said, let us be one. And that's where this is the heart of mysticism in my understanding. And according to mystics of my faith and other faiths, that mysticism is about union with God. But it's not about gaining union that you don't have. It's about unpacking the union that is already within us, waiting to be discovered. And so in that moment when I said, let us be one, I was sort of imagining us almost like breathing the same time, breathing the same breath, moving together, like synchronized swimmers, I suppose. But something really changed. And I don't expect that anyone should have this experience. This was just for me, but I felt in that moment surrounded, like God was all around me like a cloak. I'll be totally honest with you, that's never changed. And that was 25 years ago or more. And not for a single moment of a single day by not being conscious of union with God, like really tangibly conscious of it around my limbs, around my body and within me. And that was the most extraordinary experience. So when I then went
Mm,
into, I felt like I'd got somewhere, like for me, it was like a promised land.
mm,
And at that point, whatever I've been through, I mean, I've been through some horrible things since then, but it's that closeness of God. It's more than closeness, that union with God that has always kept me going.
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
my story.
Huh. Yeah, there's a couple things I wanna respond to, that I wrote down when you were talking. The first thing is I think it's really important for people to hear that you said from the you don't consider yourself you're not a Pentecostal or in any denomination right now, but you
Yeah,
kept some of the things that you got from that time in your life. And I think that's a really powerful thing for people to hear because going back on what we talked about last week with deconstruction, a lot of times the assumption is that people who are deconstructing are burning everything down, they're throwing everything out, they're disposing of it all. And of course, there are some things, that might have been toxic or might have felt abusive in different ways or whatever the case may be that we have to burn and get rid of. But there are some things that you take forward with you. And I think that's important for people to hear is you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like I grew up talked about last week in a very conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical world, there's a lot of things there that I've ditched and I've thrown away, and I'll tied it in the bag and threw it in the can and never going to take it out again. But there are
yeah,
some things that I'm really grateful for from my experience that I've brought forward with me, like my even my appreciation for the Bible. Like I don't see
yeah,
the Bible anymore like I used to at all, but I still have a very deep love and appreciation for it. And I feel like that appreciation came from that time in my life. And that's something that I don't think I'll ever get rid of. Even like Jesus, like there's this extreme dedication to Jesus. And although I see Jesus in entirely different ways than I used to, that's something that's really precious to me that I think I'll always take forward with me in my faith. So I think I just wanted to point out for people to hear it's okay to take things with you. You don't have to throw it all away.
absolutely. And in fact, I'm going to be writing a book on exactly that this year.
Hmm. There you go. Well, that way you can come back then for your fourth or fifth time and you can talk about that as well. But the other thing that, I think is really important is, it seems like you walked into, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you walked into this idea of mysticism before you really knew what it was. Like you were
Yeah,
thinking in a mystical kind of a way. You were having
yeah,
this experience with God. That's all very mystical language, but you may not have had the official terminology to put onto it. So I think that's the way that a lot of people walk into it because you kind of have this experience with the divine. You have this experience and your thoughts begin to shift and then someone else comes along, maybe someone like yourself who has also had a similar experience maybe further down the road, able to help you put some language onto it. And I feel like that's kind of like what you're doing. Would you agree with that?
yeah, I would. I'd agree with it so much that I don't need to comment or alter it in any way.
Perfect. The other thing too, I mean, you think about, I think oneness is a big, that's something that I've really been wrestling with a lot because, growing up in our world that we were in, there's a lot of dichotomies, right? There's a lot of separateness, and especially when it comes to God or the divine, it's like
Mm,
God is this amazing, vast being, and I'm this small little worm. I'm this wretch. Like there's this great division, this great chasm between us and the divine that only Jesus can bridge, and we have to do all these different things to cross the bridge and to get to God, but this idea of oneness is so it's literally changed, I think, everything for me. And I'm very early in my journey of, thinking about mysticism and things like that. But even just rethinking, like we talked about last week with Jesus, you know, for me these days, like Jesus isn't this guy that took his dad's beating for me, the one that I deserved, but he's God, Jesus is God's mirror to the world, like showing me who I really am and like what I'm really meant to be and created to be. And it
yeah.
reminds me of those verses. I think there's one in Matthew, one in John, where Jesus says, "I am the light of the world," and he says, "You are the light of the world." Right? It's
Mm,
like he's identifying himself in the same way that he identifies us, and I think that that's just such a huge signal saying that you and I are one. And he says that I and the Father are one. So they're connected, we're all just connected. And I think that when you see yourself in that way, like it changes everything for you. I think it has for me. And I am assuming it would be the same for you.
I mean, absolutely. Um, how can I put this? Uh, how could we be wretches and small and insignificant if we're
Yeah.
one with God? You know, it starts with being made in His image, her
Hmm.
image. Um, that's an incredible thing. We all carry this package of incredible value, and I think this is where the Calvinists and others like them get it really wrong. Is they think that they talk about how we're sort of we're all subject to original sin
Hmm.
and we're all wretched. That's our sort of fundamental state. But our fundamental state is original goodness
Yeah.
because we come from the heart of God.
Yeah.
And so I see us as masterpieces in need of restoration, rather than crap paintings that God has sort of draped a nice sheet of Jesus over to make it pretty enough to be in heaven. You
Yeah.
know, we're meant to go there hiding under our cloak of righteousness, hoping He doesn't spot what we're really like.
Yeah.
I think we're far more than traditional Christianity in its various forms allows us to believe or encourages us to believe.
Yeah.
Now, I have a line, and this is where I disagree with some folk, but then it wouldn't be a fun talk if there was no disagreement, would it? I don't believe we are God. That's where I sort of draw the line
Hmm.
because I can tell the difference between me and God. I'm not omnipotent. Um, I'm not perfect. Um, and yet I am given and I share the aspect and the character of God, but the creation responds to the creator
Hmm.
in a way that's suitable. In my view, I can't go along with this, we are all God, but because I gain so much from knowing, for example, in my faith, the belief that Jesus God was God himself, which I know some people are moving away from these days, even mystical folk. I think the idea that Jesus was God himself and yet humbled himself in the way he did is such an extraordinary message. And it touches me so profoundly that God would be like that, that we have a loving God, because we could have a despot,
Hmm.
but we don't. We have a God of love. And to see that in Jesus and what he gave up and what he did to serve us um, touches me so deeply that if I move away from that, the loss is too great. I lose too much of my heart and what
Hmm.
makes me so grateful to be in a relationship with God. So I don't go with the we are all God, but I think when people are saying that, what they're really trying to say, and I can get hung up on language.
Hmm.
It's a fairly typical for a writer, I suppose. But what they're trying to say is this thing about union, that
Yep.
we are far greater than we have yet conceived of. And
Yep.
the Bible talks about the powers of the age to come, and no one has conceived what God has prepared for us. There's all kinds of stuff in wait. There's all kinds of stuff in here that
Hmm.
we're yet to discover. But for me, I love the fact that I'm not God. I don't want that burden on my shoulders. It's a hard job.
Everybody should be really thankful that I'm not God.
I would be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I agree with that. I think, before it's, perhaps I wasn't as clear as I wanted to be, but I think that the Jesus being God's mirror to the world for me is just a reminder of the image in which I'm created in.
Yeah,
Like I am
yeah,
not necessarily the image in the mirror, but I feel like it's God's reminder that this is the image that you were made in. You were made in my image. And I think that, like I told the story last week of meeting my daughter for the first time when she was in the NICU tank and she reached out and she grabbed my finger. Like there's a degree of separateness there because she's not me and I'm not her. But yet there's this deep connection there where we are one because we share the same blood, we share the same DNA. My spark, so to speak, will always be in her. And so we're connected. And so like these days, to borrow from like I think it's a Buddhist idea about like the ocean and the waves, right? Like I feel like for me, I know that Buddhism isn't gonna think of it in the same manner because of not necessarily emphasizing the God piece, but for me, like God is like the ocean, and all of us are just waves of the ocean. Like I'm not the ocean, you're not the ocean. We're waves in the ocean, but yet we're so connected to the ocean that when we fall back into it, we become one with it. So there again, there's like a degree of separateness, but there's also a degree of unity. And I think that the unity piece is also important because it's not just that we're so connected to God, but that also makes us so connected to each other, right? Because you and I share that same spark. And so you and I are just as connected to each other in a sense as we are to the divine.
Now, I should do what you do and write things down as you're talking because three things have occurred to me. The first is, what is that you've just described, if not mysterious?
Hmm.
It's absolutely wonderful. And this is going to sound awfully poncy, but or pompous perhaps. Excuse my language. But someone once said to me that you never really know you're getting to the core of a matter if you can't feel the tension from both sides. You know,
Yeah.
if it, and I like being in that place of tension where you can feel the paradox sort of pulling you,
Yeah.
and that is fundamentally mysterious.
Yeah.
And when I was younger, I was always looking for the concrete, but I'm not looking for that now.
Yep.
Um, Also, Jesus, he expressed his great will for us. As you've said, he prayed, and it's sort of towards the end of John. And I love the Gospel of John
Mhm.
because, again, I sometimes wonder, is what I've been told true? But according to what I understand, John was his best chum, or at
Yeah.
least John thought he was his best chum, because John refers to himself in the Gospel of John as the beloved or the disciple that Jesus loved.
Yeah.
Um, Again, I may not fully know all the facts. Sometimes people tell me things that surprise me about who wrote what and when, and then I'm like, okay, my idea was rubbish. But anyway, towards the end of the Gospel of John, which is a beautiful book. I love the Gospel of John most of all because it focuses on the heart of Jesus more than the miracles and
Mhm.
actions of.
Yeah.
And towards the end, Jesus, before he's crucified, Jesus prays these prayers for his disciples and also for us. And his greatest wish is that we be one, just as he and the Father are one.
Yeah.
And that's a mystery. That is wonderful. It's that union again. And in, I think it's Ephesians, it says that the goal, the ultimate end of the goal of the gospel, the will of God, is to bring all things into unity under Christ.
Yeah.
Well, that is a clear statement of universal salvation for one thing,
Yeah.
um, and another emphasis on this idea of union. But the challenge and this is my third point, the challenge of this is if you really believe in union, then you've got to start seeing other people different.
That's right.
Yeah, I can't look down on folk. I can't judge and divide and put people in categories. I still do. I try not to, but that sort of the challenge of a belief in union as the ultimate goal of God means I need to love everybody,
That's right.
and that gets tough.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I had somebody on the show a while ago. I don't remember who it was, but we were talking about this idea and how mysticism, coming to this understanding of unity, really has the power to solve a lot of the world's problems, whether it's our individual lives and the problems that we have, or even on a worldwide scale with countries battling each other and different things like that. Like, if we could really see how connected we really are, like, how could I possibly really hate you and want to hurt you if I see that the same divine spark, so to speak, that's in you is also in me? Like, I would be hurting myself if I hurt you. And then I'm also hurting the divine if I hurt you. So it's like this circle of pain that we cause each other when we try to hurt each other. And it's this cycle that I think if we could just see how connected we are, we could begin to break the cycle. And like you said before, you still forget, right? You have this mystical mindset, this approach to unity in your life, but you still forget. But I think just like meditation, when you're meditating and you get distracted, the moment of greatness is the moment that you come back and go, "Oh yeah, I realize I'm distracted," and you choose to come back to the center.
Yeah,
And I think that it's that way in life with mysticism, as I know, and in unity, is I might forget for a moment, and I might have this anger towards you and this hatred towards you, but the time in between me realizing that hatred is there gets shorter and shorter as I wake up and I remember, oh yes, I am connected to Duncan and I need to approach this in a different way.
Yeah. It's actually very comforting to think that we're all connected in that way, because if, as a person who can suffer with low self-esteem, that's one of my vulnerabilities. Just thinking of some of the wonderful people around me that I'm in union with, it sort of raises my self-view to some degree as well.
Right. Yep.
Maybe I reveal too much.
I have the same sort of struggle, so I'm with you in there. One of the things that I've come to realize, and I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, is that mysticism isn't like its own religion, right? It's not like it's not its own thing, nor does it have its home in one single religion, right? Like you don't convert to mysticism like you would to Christianity or some other religion, but nor is mysticism only a Christian thing or only a Jewish thing or whatever, but rather mystics can be found in all these different religions. And even I've come to understand within no religion at all. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that, because I know you've explored other faith traditions and things like that. What have you discovered about mysticism beyond the wall of what most of our listeners would be familiar with, like in Christianity? Like, what does mysticism look like in other places? Does it differ depending on kind of the shell that it's surrounded with, or is it always like the same? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, that's a good question. So I'm not going to claim to be an expert on multiple faiths, um, but I have encountered mysticism in Islam,
Hmm.
and specifically the Sufi branch of Islam.
Hmm.
And my belief, my assumption is that mysticism, i.e., the experience of the divine, is found everywhere,
Hmm.
in all sorts of people who follow all sorts of traditions. Because why would God close his heart to somebody because they call him by a different name? It's just very peculiar. I'm sure that the verse of the Bible that says that God responds to, rewards those that diligently seek him, or diligently unpick these ideas of division and separation. I think that applies to across the board. Why should it only apply to Christians? Um, anyway, I when I was going through my deconstruction phase, well, I say phase, it lasted a long time, but one is still going on actually to some degree. But I came across this wonderful poetry that some of my friends were sharing. You know, sitting around the table, we were just playing cards, and someone says, "Oh, I've got this book of poetry. Would you like to hear one?" And it absolutely grabbed me. Can I read you one?
Sure, please.
It's by Hafiz of Shiraz, who was a 14th century mystic
Mm.
um, within the Sufi tradition, which, as I said, is a branch of Islam. I think I'm going to read you. Yeah, because this one, this is great. It's called "If God Invited You to a Party,"
Mm.
and I love the language of this. It feels incredibly modern and relevant, and I'll tell you how I feel about it afterwards. I'll interpret it a little bit. If God invited you to a party and said, "Everyone in the ballroom tonight will be my special guest," how would you treat them when you arrived? Indeed, indeed. And Hafiz knows there is no one in this world who is not upon his jeweled dance floor.
Mm.
And I love that because it's so challenging. This was a guy, Hafiz, his mysticism, much like mine, much like every other person I know with mystical tendencies, came from the experience of God, from the personal practice of being with God, and getting to know God. It's about tuning in and awareness. And so his mysticism informs his thinking, just like encountering God in any tradition informs your thinking and your theology. So if God invited you to a party, I'm thinking of this as a sort of conservative evangelical, as I used to be. And I was very, very much of the opinion that we had it right and everyone else needed to be like us.
Yep.
If God invited you to a party and said, "Everyone in the ballroom tonight will be my special guest," How would you treat them when you arrive? And I think as in my old mindset, I would have assumed they'd all be like me. They'd all be Christians. They'd all be following a particular tradition.
Mm.
But actually, what if they're not? Everyone in the ballroom tonight will be my special guest. Let's call that saint and sinner. Let's talk about people from every tradition and background, and they're all God's special guests. How would you treat them? And I love this pause that he brings in. Indeed, indeed, because it's horrifying to the conservative mind. And Hafiz knows there is no one in this world who is not upon his jeweled dance floor. So
Mm.
not only invited, but already there. And I just find that so tremendously challenging. It's about union once
Mm.
again. It's about humility. It's about seeing people through the eyes of love. When I read this guy's poetry, I feel like if I was a good poet, I could have written that, because his sentiments are sentiments that my mystical experience leads me to embrace as well.
Yeah.
So I just felt my view of it is that you can feel the commonality between people who love spending time with the divine.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you keep using the word awareness, right? Because it's something that, like you said earlier, it's always been there. It's
Yeah,
about just becoming aware that this is the reality in which we live, and that all the separateness that we've been raised with and we've been taught is all an illusion, like that. None of that is really real. And I think that that's the beauty of mysticism, is once you become more aware of what's always been, the mystery only increases, because now it's like, well, how can this be? Like, what does this mean? How does this change things for me? What could be if we all embrace it? Like the mystery just expands from that moment on, as we begin to embrace and understand and unpack this reality that's always been there.
I think it's important to acknowledge that experientially it's very different. Once you've unpacked something like this and you
Hmm.
start to live it, you do enter a completely different experience of life.
Yeah.
But it's not something you've earned. It's not something that you've got that
Yep.
someone else doesn't have.
Yep.
And I think it's crucial to emphasize both, because otherwise, I think what can happen is people have got sick of the boxy thinking of
Mhm.
evangelical um, dogma. And so they want to move away from all that. And then they hear this stuff about union and just becoming aware and think, oh, well, that's it now. And because I'm aware that it's about awareness, that I'm there. But that's not the case.
Right.
We all need to develop this through the practice, through the discipline of spiritual discipline.
That's right.
Um, Much like there was a monk who he wrote a little book called "Practicing the Presence of God," Brother
Mhm.
Lawrence.
Yeah.
I don't really agree with much that he says in there, but I love the stuff about the presence of God and how he just spent all of his time joyfully reveling in the love and the company of God.
Yeah.
And I think that the phrase "practicing the presence of God," I don't think you can be mystical without that. I think that
Yeah.
has to be in there somewhere, but it's got to be organic. It can be meditation. It can be all kinds of things. Um, and that's really, without saying that, I'm not offering any practical tips.
And going back to what you were saying, kind of the original question that we were circling around, about different faith traditions. And I think it's you made a comment before that, like, you don't imagine God being closed off to people who call him by a different name, right? Like, who see him to be different. And I think Richard Rohr uses illustration of, like, imagine we're all out in the woods and we come across this massive stream of water, and we all dip our cups into the stream of water, and we take a sip, like, oh, it tastes so good, so refreshing. But then we all insist that our cup of water is the only cup that can quench our thirst. And he said that's kind of what we do with religion. Like, we're all out in the woods, we're all faced with this big stream of the divine, but we take our religious cups and we dip them into the water, and then we insist that our cup is the one that can quench the thirst of the world. When in reality, there's this roaring stream right in front of us that's the source of all of the water. And he said that's kind of like what religion is. And sometimes our cups can be special to us, they can be meaningful to us, and they can be wonderful and help us in our own journeys. But the reality is that we're all dipping our cups into that same stream. And for me, that really kind of blew my mind because again, I was raised with that separateness that everybody's got to be like me on the dance floor. And if back then, if God would have said to me, like, everybody on the dance floor is my special guest, I would have said, God, you're wrong. But that Richard Rohr illustration always meant a lot to me.
I think there's a paradox in that, at least for me, because
Yeah,
that earlier we talked about the tension of sort of being in the middle of two ideas.
yeah,
I do agree with what Richard Rohr said about that. I like it, but there's also an element that not necessarily Richard Rohr himself, but that other folks sometimes go into that I'm not so comfortable with, and that's because I think it's very comfortable to sort of say, well, everything's the same, because that way you don't have to, there are no battles to fight at all.
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but what if, I'll put it this way, I tried that thinking on like a cloak
Hmm.
and it was comfortable, but after a couple of days, that's how I sort of test ideas. I sort of try and think them and see how I feel emotionally as a response and how my mystical experience is affected. And there was so much loss in it for me. And I felt it wasn't somewhere I could go in terms of completely just seeing everything as the same.
Hmm.
Because the problem was it made Jesus less.
Mm.
It just made him one of many. And there are folk who believe, folk that I respect and love and are friends of mine, that they believe that Jesus was a bloke who sort of had a theosis, and there was nothing sort of innately special about him.
Mhm,
Um, and if I go down that route, I lose too much,
mhm,
because for me, the Jesus through whom the world was framed, the universe was framed, giving himself, humbling himself, serving to bring us all into this great unity, is too precious for me to say, well, I wouldn't expect anyone else of another faith to step who wants to engage in interfaith unity
mhm,
and sort of step away from their faith and get less from it.
mhm,
I think people should be passionate about what their own mystical experience and their beliefs, whilst embracing all they can learn from other faiths too. And for me, there's a paradox in that, because I do agree and I don't agree, and I
mhm.
can't explain it very well.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. And I think something I'm starting to learn, and you might agree with this, you might disagree, but something I'm kind of an understanding I'm coming to in my own journey is the importance, like Jesus can still maintain a very primary spot in my faith, but I think there comes a point where I need to ask myself, whose Jesus is the central part of my thinking? Because I'm similar to the Bible. I said before about how I've, deep appreciation for the Bible and Jesus growing up in my evangelical background. But there came a point in my life where I had to put the Bible down for a
Mm-hmm.
while because I
Yeah.
couldn't see the Bible for what it really is. I could only see the Bible for what I've been taught that it is. And so I had to separate myself for a while from it. And I almost feel like there's a very similar thing with Jesus, which makes a lot of Christians very nervous because, like, well, Jesus is the central, Jesus is central. You can't give up on Jesus. I don't think that I'm at a place in my life where I'm giving up on Jesus, but I'm really trying to understand Jesus for who Jesus really is, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to who I've been told he is,
Mm-hmm.
what I've been told he represents.
Yeah.
Even just my own thinking of just kind of reading the Bible and coming to my own understanding of Jesus, like asking Jesus, like, who are you really? And I had somebody on the podcast, actually, as of our conversation, the episode dropped today. She is a magician and a sorceress, and she teaches witchcraft. And this was a very, very challenging conversation for me to have because that world I was taught growing up is evil, demonic. You don't go anywhere near that. So I really want to talk to this person to understand her perspective. And she really challenged me, and she said, I think there's a point where a lot of Christians need to almost exercise Jesus out of their life so that they can then welcome Jesus back in for who Jesus really is, as opposed to just what you've been taught about him. And for me, like that's just become a very powerful thing. So I think that, like, as I think about other religions, as I interact with other religions, Jesus for me remains very central, but I'm trying to understand who Jesus is, in perspective to the other faiths that are out there, because I don't think he's against these other faiths. I don't think he's, like I was taught, he's out to have war against Islam and war against all these other things. But I think that he lives and can dwell within all of these different places. And what does that mean for me as somebody who's connected, just, who is in unity with people of these other faith traditions? So again, mystery. I don't know. I don't know, Duncan.
Well, can I respond to that? Because that's an
Please
interesting.
respond. Yes.
I'm conscious where time may be running out, but um, so you mentioned this last time we talked,
Mhm.
and at the time, I think my eyes widened like I don't even know if this goes out on video or just voice, but
Oh,
um,
that's right. I forgot that I did bring it up in the last conversation. I did. You're right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the language is initially off-putting
Yeah.
because the language of exorcism. Remember, I used to be a missionary.
Yeah.
I've done some of that,
Yeah.
or at least what I thought was that. And so the association is with demonic, and so the sort of the association of a demonic kind of word and Jesus is. I think it's sort of if you were trying to say something in the most off-putting way,
Yep.
that might win. But joking aside, there is a really valid point there. First of all, I don't think anyone should operate from fear.
Mhm.
And this kind of don't give up on Jesus, don't give up on Jesus, that sounds to me like a fear-driven response. It's sort of a knee-jerk, uh-oh, I could be going down to hell kind of. It's sort
Yeah.
of it's kind of feeling to it. But also, you're right that people have these weird images, sort of pictures of who Jesus is and who God is.
Mhm.
And there's so much contradiction of doctrine and dogma within whatever church background we come from and other church backgrounds that it can be really important to step away completely.
Yeah.
And that includes from the idea of God that you have. I believe, I agree
Yeah.
with you. Something I did when I was in a strange Bible school in Alabama, of all places. And one of the things we did was we studied the Alcoholics Anonymous
Mhm.
12-step program.
Yep.
And it was a particular version of it. I don't know if this occurs in every version of it, but one of the steps was to fire your God,
Mhm.
sack God.
Yep.
And the idea was very much what you just said, that you have this idea of God, but that idea of God may not have much to do with God himself. And so if we're really seeking mystical experience and a true kind of free-flowing connection and union with God, then we may have to spend some time getting rid of a lot of stuff. And it can be really difficult to try and do that while fully engaged with it.
Yeah.
So just to say, I understand where you're coming from, and I do think that can be really important for people.
Yeah. Yeah. So good, Duncan. We are just about out of time, but this has, as I knew, this was wonderful. Thank you for taking time for us. Thank you again for the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. And just in case people weren't here last week, real quick, where can people interact with you online? Anywhere you want to point us to?
Okay, so my name is Duncan Pile. It's
Mhm.
Pile, as in pile of insert noun, and be
Pile of
kind and
awesome.
that'll do. Yes,
Yeah.
better than I've ever had. So you can find me on Facebook.
Mhm.
I use a private page as a public page. I sort of try and just stay real on that page, whether it's talking about faith, linking talks, or just being funny, making jokes or whatever. I actually coach people in the process of deconstruction. And if anyone is interested in that, they're very welcome to get in touch through that page, through Messenger.
Mhm.
I'm also a writer on Patheos, that's patheos.com, and just search for Duncan Edward Pile or Duncan Pile, and all of my many articles will come up because I've been writing for them for 4 or 5 years.
Mhm.
I hope people will get in touch. I do love interaction.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes, and we have some more conversations planned for later in the fall. So we'll
Brilliant.
revisit.
Thank you.
Excellent.